today we're going to start 4.4, Impact and Reconstruction. And what we're going to look at today is really what happened after the Civil War. What did we do to try to put the country back together? So during the war, part of the impact was the tensions that lie between whites and African Americans in the North, right? So we talk about slavery, but there's also a lot of tensions in the North as well. 600,000 men had died during the U.S. Civil War, and it was the deadliest war that we have ever been involved in. So because of that, they had to institute a draft law. And that happened in 1863. And what that said was that men between the ages of 20 to 45 had to register. However, for the draft, you could avoid it if you paid $300. Well, obviously that only applied to a small group of people, especially in 1863, that actually had the money to pay to get out of it. So this led to a series of draft riots that you can see over here to the right. And essentially what happened is white men were angered because they lost their jobs. Sorry. To freed black men. And they didn't want to serve in the war. In the end, 12 African Americans were lynched. And this is super important because what it shows us is that there was a lot of racial tensions in the North. So even though we had a lot of abolitionists and people wanted to end slavery, that tension between whites and African Americans still very much existed. It was not by any stretch of the imagination a perfect equal land in the North. So this is important to know when we go into Reconstruction, that these tensions were definitely there and definitely existed. So after the war, we saw Congress really expand its power. To include or to have power over, or to include a government role in economic issues. And we still turn to the government today, even when we have economic issues. Like, for example, with the stimulus packages during coronavirus, that is the government and getting involved in economic issues within the country. And we can really trace that all the way back to right after the Civil War. So one thing that the Congress did was promote business development. And again, we still see that today. What kind of tax breaks can we give to businesses? What can we do to help businesses be successful right now during coronavirus? And so how did they do this? Well, they did this by a couple of ways. First, they expanded the railroad. They knew that that was essential to business development. And the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. The second thing they did was what we see right here, the Homestead Act. And because the railroad had expanded, more people could move westward. And so you could get 160 acres of land for $10 west of the Mississippi. And then the third thing they did was what we call the Morrill Act. And this is where they gave states money to establish universities. So these things were all meant to help establish a stronger economy in the United States. So the impact of the war. So the South really struggled with food and resources. Remember, the North produced everything. However, the North, it wasn't all that great either. There was a huge economic division between factory owners who made a lot of money and ordinary workers really struggled. And again, this is important because it's leading us into that tension, right? You have a lot of working class people that just aren't making very much money. And so that's going to start to cause tension. And then on April 14th of 1865, Lincoln was assassinated. And Andrew Johnson became president. Which drastically changed the plans for Reconstruction. So Reconstruction was what happens after the war is over. How do we put the nation back together? And essentially, this led from January 1st of 1863 all the way to March 31st of 1877. Overall, it was kind of viewed as a failure, but we'll talk about why in a moment. So the first step in Reconstruction was what we call the Reconstruction Amendments. And those were the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment made anyone born here a citizen. And the 15th Amendment gave the right for men to vote. So that was the first step in Reconstruction. But Reconstruction was not all, but Reconstruction caused a lot of issues and a lot of problems in addition to just passing these three amendments. And the first was a backlash to this, right? So we had a backlash to Reconstruction and trying to create a more equal environment for African Americans. And the first backlash was what we call the Jim Crow laws. And they were essentially laws that encouraged segregation and unequal treatment. And what we see here is a picture, a caricature of the Jim Crow. It was originally this puppet that would travel around and do shows. It was very stereotypical and not viewed in a good light. So because of this, we also had what we call the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau, the goal of the Freedmen's Bureau was to try to provide homes and clothing and food and medicine for African Americans. They even built schools. And all of this ended in 1877 when we ended military occupation in the South. And when I say it ended, I meant the Freedmen's Bureau. My apologies. The backlash with the Jim Crow laws did not end in 1877. It continues, and I think people could even argue it to some extent even into today's society. And the post-war amendments obviously are still very much in effect.